All right, for part two of our show today, we're going to discuss. There was a recent article in the Atlantic that talked about the rise in kind of race pseudoscience, discussions about race pseudoscience that are percolating in right wing circles, and also trying to really be pushed into the mainstream. So I wanted to kind of react to that. We've done a show on a eugenics documentary you can find in our archives, maybe a year or two ago, and this was I think the documentary that was on PBS and talking about eugenics, which was a lot about race science or talking about genetics and genetically predisposed and all that and the rise and fall of that. So it piqued our interest in light of the discussion we've already had on this, looking at the early 1900s and so forth. So Tunde, what are your thoughts on this recent uptick in right-wing circles of people trying to kind of mainstream race pseudoscience and present it as if it was like legitimate stuff?
This is a good question, man. What do I think about it? I find it interesting because it's another example of just kind of the cycle of certain patterns of societies, and I think it's a reflection of the insecurity of the majority group right now. And this reminds me, like you said, of the eugenics show we did.
But you shouldn't say it like that. It's not everybody in the majority group. It's some people. Yeah.
Correct. Some people. I mean, if it was everybody, we'd obviously the world would look a lot different. So thankfully, it's. I think it's a loud minority. Let's put it that way. And today's America, maybe not 100 years ago, that would have been the case. But I think just like this show we did on eugenics, which was about the period, kind of the late 1800s through the early 20th century, like 1930s, 1920s, when it really gained prominence, was the idea of trying to create a scientific backing and some sort of scientific proof that there's a difference in humans. In between what
that's determined by race.
Correct. That we race, consider as
and then
a race.
Other things, but race being one of them. Yeah.
Correct. And so, I was under the impression as I was growing up and learning about things like the Holocaust and World War II, and just in general, kind of where the world had gone in the 20th century, that those type of ideas would be left in the past. And clearly they haven't, and and that's why I said I think it reflects an insecurity by many, just like it did in the 1920s when you had a lot of immigration from Eastern Europe, for example. Today, the immigration's from other areas of the world, but still creates insecurity.
Remember, that was one of the things that stood out to us in that was the immigration from Eastern Europe. They were considered a different race than kind of the Western European Anglo, like that type of thing, and they were considered to be one of the most notable things that from a race standpoint, it was, like you had the Western Europeans, then you had the Northern blacks, then you had under the Northern blacks were the Eastern Europeans. Yeah. And then it was just like, it was very arbitrary from, our point of view, but it was something like these guys were trying to make this stuff, like actually trying to do this stuff scientifically.
Yeah, hence the term pseudoscience. And I think that's what reminds me so much of that era today, because these ideas, what happens is because they're not fact and evidence-based, and the evidence they're based on is pseudo-evidence, like, okay, we live in America, so I see blacks and whites the way they are here. But they don't, necessarily go around the world and see how that plays out. So the idea is that these ideas have always been there. But what happens is they gain traction, like we're talking about in this article, when they meet money, when they're well funded. And I think that's what reminds me of the 1920s and 30s is at that time you had wealthy people who are kind of eccentric in the culture and who are the first generations of their wealth making their money, like Henry Ford, who had an entire publication called The International Jew in the 1920s. And into the 30s. And then you had people like Charles Lindbergh, who became the head of the America First movement and was a fascist and who was supportive of the Nazis. And remember, this is, again, why history is important, to learn about our own history in the United States. And fortunately for those guys in history, World War II helped erase a lot of that domestically, because once we got into the war against the Nazis and all that, kind of became taboo to talk about who in America was supporting that stuff prior to 1940.
Well, to fill in the gap on that, the Nazis kind of took this stuff and made it their gospel. And so like there was like, okay, the race science people here, like the people and the people that were the Nazis or became the Nazis, supported the Nazis, their leadership looked at that stuff and was like, hey, that's a great idea. Let's adopt that stuff. So
Yeah.
it became by because of the way the Nazis handled it, it became like, whoa, so that's the end game here of this kind of race science stuff. But the thing about it that stands out to me more than that is that they couldn't actually prove the science. Like, it was all like, yes, there were terrible outcomes that came from this kind of race pseudoscience stuff that people were doing in that 50-year period or whatever, late 1800s through early to mid 1900s. But they actually couldn't do the science either. The science didn't work. They had to cherry pick things. They had to look at things and say, oh, okay, yeah, well, we'll look at it like this, but not like that. And so because of that, because the science could not be verified, peer review, all that kind of stuff, it became, that's why we call it a pseudoscience. It's like, okay, yeah, we can't actually establish this stuff. What we're going to do is say things that may seem on a surface to have some kind of viability. We're going to say it. We're going to say it enough. We'll back it up with selectively plucked evidence, and then we'll leave it at that. But again, if you ever subject that stuff to scrutiny, which the scientific method, that's the whole point, is to come up with theories. Well, come up with hypotheses, test them, then present a theory. And then the rest of the scientific community is supposed to try to test that stuff to see if you can knock it out, and that's where progress happens. So when it gets to people come up with these ideas, they put them out there, people test them and knock them all out. And they're like, oh, well, we just believe it still anyway. And it's like, well, hold up. That's kind of not how, by that logic. And this is, I think you made a great point offline when we were talking about this, is like, it's kind of like the flat earther people, like, it's like, yeah, people believed the earth was flat for a really long time. Then science came along and knocked that off. People proved that wrong with science. And that kind of stuff, is just kind of, okay, well, it's been proven wrong. But now we got people that are back and say, yeah, the earth, the earth is flat, and it's like, well, hold up. But this, and then if you take and actually we've done a documentary on this as well in our archives. But when they try to scientifically verify their stuff and it doesn't work, they don't reconsider the theory. They just try other ways to try to verify it. But again, it's one of those things that the way you actually produce progress in science isn't by trying to prove something true. It's whether you can prove it false. And so once you can prove it false, generally you move on. You don't sit there and try other ways to prove it true, because the way you just proved it false doesn't go away if you find another way where it actually does work out.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the flat Earth concept, because it's true. That's a pseudoscience. And when we did the show on that documentary, that's what was happening. We could see it in real time with some of those people where they were doing their own experiments.
When they were doing
proving that the earth was round, and they were kind of like dumbfounded. They're like, well, hold on. This isn't
and their reaction was, okay, well, we got to do something else. We got to figure out another way to prove it. It's like, well, hold on, bro. You've already proved your premise wrong.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to actually share here, because in preparing for today, it's interesting. As being 46 years old now, I remember when I used to see things. I remember the book The Bell Curve that came out in 1994, and I was in high school. And one of the authors, a guy named Charles Murray, who's still running around today trying to push this pseudoscience stuff about blacks having lower IQ and more prone to violence and all this. Back then, when I was young, I used to get offended and I get emotional, and you get all upset that somebody's trying to call your groups stupid and inferior. And it's funny, as an adult now, just well educated and a man of the world. Like, I really feel sorry for these people. Like because you're right. Like, looking at this pseudoscience on race and this people now trying to find and create these faux scientific measurements to say how blacks are inferior in IQ, and even in the article they say how, but Chinese and Ashkenazi Jews have a higher IQ than white people. Like, this is like the most dumbest thing I've ever heard. And so
they're not going to China and like testing all these people in China.
Like how many people? I bet you in the average high school in China, guess what? Half the students are C or below. Half the students get a C or above. I mean, they're human beings like us. And then I love how they split the Jews. So the Ashkenazi Jews, which are the Eastern Europeans, are the more intelligent ones. So that means the Sephardic, which are the more, the ones that are more from the Moorish and the North African and the Arab, they're not as intelligent. So it's just like, and it goes back to, you're taking a religion, which is Judaism, and calling it a race. So it's just like the Nazis. And so, it just, that's what I'm saying. It's more saddens me. I'm like, man, these guys are losers. Like, really, this guy's 30 years ago, he wrote this book and he's still on this stuff. He reminds me of the people we saw in Flat Earth. That there's no proof. It's like the big lie with the election. There's no proof, but yet people just gonna believe this stuff, and it's just. But that's where, and then hold on, let me hand it back to you because I'm about to go.
Well, I'll tell you this. I mean, it's one of those things. As if you look at it with a certain level of context, it's like, of course, like in the sense that some people, as you talked about, they feel a certain way because they feel like their station or their group station is threatened or something like that. We've talked before about people who put a lot of their own self-worth into not characteristics about themselves, not who they are, but what they are. I'm proud of myself because I'm a man, or I'm proud of myself because I'm, my race and stuff like that. Versus, that's being proud of what you are, and so, but if you're proud of who you are, you don't need this kind of stuff. But if you're proud of what you are and the what is you think is threatened, these are kind of defense mechanisms. And I look at it like, what it reminds me of, nobody ever does this kind of race pseudoscience where whatever race they think they are, or their gender or whatever it is, comes out in the bottom. Like it reminds me, like if you look at all ancient civilizations, when they drew maps, their civilization was always in the center of the map. It was like, hey, we're where everything is, and all this other stuff, or the remote stuff, the outposts and all that, but the center is us. And so, of course, like you see, like in an article we'll have in the show notes, there's a guy talking about, blacks tend to commit murders about 10 times often per capita as whites, and it's not all explained by poverty. Okay. We can question, whether he has submitted that for peer review to see if anybody can prove it with controls and stuff like that. Doesn't matter though. He's going to present that as if it's some fact. But this same guy wouldn't come out with some kind of thing like, well, judging by American history, whites are, X number of times more likely to commit lynchings than blacks. Like he's not going to look at that. He's not going to look at that. He's like, that's not going to be something that, because he's going to want to center it in a way that makes whatever group he feels he belongs to perceived well. So it's one of those things where you can see kind of how the self-interest and that kind of, that mentality is at work there. And where the problem is, like, people are allowed to do that kind of stuff. Again, I subscribe to, freedom of speech. The issue is more where it becomes being presented like, hey, this is science. This is something that we verified, which we've seen, like we talked about before, 100 years ago. It doesn't stand up to the test. And then since then, now that we got all this genetic stuff, now, it's like, actually, from a genetic standpoint, you can't really tell the difference between the races. Once you go inside, and it's like, so now they didn't even have that in the early 1900s when they were disproving this stuff. Now they got that, and it's just like, all right, so this is just fulfilling some kind of emotional need.
Yeah, and I think, because you bring up some great points. I mean, one of the things I thought of when I saw in the article about the blacks, tend to commit murder at a rate 10 times more than whites, the first thought I had in my mind, the only 2 world wars in the history of the world are started by Europeans. But then I thought, but that guy's comeback to me would be, but blacks aren't smart enough to start big wars like that because they can't fly planes.
But again,
that's the point, right? It's stupid to have these. Yeah,
correct. He wouldn't look at Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin and the tens of millions of people that those people killed, and like that would be something he would explain away. It would be like, okay, but because again,
somehow it'd be the black people's fault and the Jews. It would be because they didn't have DEI hires. That's why.
But now tell me this: do you think that there's any significance, or do you attach any significance to the idea that we see, like we also see coming from the right wing a lot of times, an effort to block the teaching of history, and then now we're seeing in similar circles, overlapping circles, a reviving of things that were disproven in the past, so like, do you see any kind of, what tie do you see there? What do you see there that may tie that together?
I think it's all related because I think, look, we learned in the book Sapiens, right, that human beings are very important for societies to have certain myths. And the myths can be real or not. So, here we're talking about myths that have been skewed out of reality. So one myth I thought of was,
to your point, the book talks about how that creates cohesion amongst groups. And again, whether they're true or not, there's the myth of the U.S. dollar, allows us to create an economy, where we can all, from a worldwide standpoint at this point. But a lot of these myths, the myth of rule of law, so to speak, allows us to establish order in a way that is supposed to be, not arbitrary, supposed to be predictable.
Yeah.
But, go ahead.
No, that's a good point because it was real and imagined orders. So those were the
Yeah.
imagined orders. Real order being something like the sun coming up every day and gravity. And one of the imagined orders that we have is a caste system in human societies, which he started with Hammurabi's code 8,500 years ago, the oldest written.
Well, no.
Kind of
I was
form
going
of.
to say it may have started there, but that's just the first one they wrote down.
That's what I said. That was the oldest that we found. But
Yeah.
So this all comes down to how we act as humans and stacking each other up in their hierarchical, things. And you've said a good point that if you've got 10 guys in a basketball locker room, for example, over time, they'll stack each other into a hierarchy. There'll be an alpha male and there'll be the betas following and all that. So this is part of how we're wired. And I think, it's because one of the myths I was going to mention that I thought of was the lost cause, which, like you're saying, that was probably a necessary myth to keep the majority of the country cohesive early on after the Civil War and after Reconstruction and all that. Now, unfortunately, if you want to look at it, certain Americans took that on the chin, which was Black Americans in the South once Reconstruction was ended. But it held the country together. And so the thing about these myths, and that's why I say fast forward 100 years, going back to now, the eugenics of 100 years ago to now, why these arguments to me are a little bit murkier and harder to make. Because as I'm reading about all this aggression against blacks in the way that these and the intelligence and all this, I started thinking, well, back in the 20s, you didn't have black migration to the United States because that wasn't allowed legally. Only whites were allowed to immigrate to the United States. But what have we had now? We've had about almost 60 years of open immigration. So if you look at statistically, the number one in terms of positive statistical measures of immigrant groups is Nigerians. Nigerians have the highest per capita income, highest on average education, so on and so forth. And what's interesting is one of the largest areas that slaves were taken and brought from Africa to the New World was the area that encompasses Nigeria. And the largest tribe in that area being the Yoruba tribe, which also goes into Ghana and Sierra Leone just because of the way the maps were drawn when they made those countries, was the largest group of Africans to be sold to the New World. So that's, to me, what pokes a hole in all of this is you've got, from a genetic and ethnic standpoint, the same blacks that were brought as slaves are the same blacks that are immigrating to this country in the last 50 years. But the ones that have immigrated have higher statistical, positive kind of demographic, like I say, per capita income, education, than white Americans statistically. So it can't be just racial stuff that separates all these numbers of like things in America, like blacks and whites on the American side. And I think that answers the question of why they need to keep manipulating information about history, because if you don't allow history to be taught, you can keep telling new generations, oh, these blacks are stupid, they're just lazy, and all that.
You can retell old lies if people don't learn that the old lies were refuted and shown to be not true in the past. Correct. And so, I think that's what ties it. And like your example is just one of many that can be cited if you want to.
I've thought about Caribbeans, Haitians, and Jamaicans that immigrate to America generally have, much higher.
Let me throw something at you, because I think that you brought out a good point, though, is like this is a fight, though, to establish the kind of myths that are going to be in place in a nation, if you object to the idea that all men are created equal, setting aside the fact that that's part of kind of the founding ethos of the United States, but if you reject that and you wanted to establish a myth that all men aren't created equal, and there's a hierarchy that's based on genetics or race and so forth, this is the kind of stuff you do have to put forward. And I think the team analogy is a great analogy. I talked about that. If it's a basketball, if it, you play basketball, I played, when I was younger, played football. In those locker rooms, a hierarchy would always emerge. You didn't have to have the coach come in and say, okay, this guy's going to be the top, this yada yada. And in fact, if you did that, it wouldn't work. Hierarchies emerge in those type of situations. And what you have here basically is you have people who either can't or don't want to win alpha status in their group, whatever group this. If this F group's going to be the United States or it's going to be wherever, they can't win alpha status. They can't walk into the room and people be like, oh yeah, that's the man, which happens in sports locker rooms, organically. It happens in any scenario organically. Some people, it's like, the way they carry themselves, the way they act, it's like, oh yeah, that's the guy that people follow, or the girl, or the woman that people follow. They can't, or they won't win that themselves. So they're trying to build it into some kind of thing where they get it by default. Like, oh, well, all you guys got to look at me as the top dog because that's how we wrote it. And it's like, no, like if you are the man, if you're so this and that, then win that, because there are plenty of settings amongst humans. That's how we organize ourselves in hierarchies automatically. And, again, what you have people here is trying to sidestep that and say, okay, well, we're going to organize ourselves in hierarchies. Let's just build it in that I can be at the top of the hierarchy. And because, again, I can't, if we just let it all, let people just interact and so forth, I won't be able to come out on top. So I got to kind of rig it in myself, rig it for myself. And so it's unfortunate, but I think it's something that's predictable. And it's one of those things that's always going to happen. Now, the idea of erasing history so that people can't learn from the past. Now, to some degree, there will always be people who look at whatever's happening now as the first time it happened or anything like that. So, what it is more is about people who would push back against them, who would do the research, is to try to make the information inaccessible to them, so that they can't find it. And they're thinking, oh man, these guys make a compelling case. So I think that it does go hand in hand. If you want to try to reestablish something that was overthrown in the past, and that rigid hierarchy did exist and was overthrown, was found to be wanting for this and that, and found to be inconsistent with American values, then you have to erase people, particularly the people who would push back against you. You have to erase that information so that the people that would inevitably push back against you again will have less ammo. So I think it's hand in hand. And, again, I think that it's important that people realize that this stuff is anti-American at its core. This is everything that America, at least what they wrote down, the stuff that Americans wrote down, whether it be in the 1770s, 1780s, 1790s, or whether it be in the 1860s, the American side, the Union, all that stuff is completely anti to this. This stuff tracks more of what the Confederacy talked about, and what the people in the Jim Crow South talked about in terms of the way that society, they wanted to organize the society. Well, so it's one of those things, and they lost then. And like if Americans who are pro-America have to ensure that they lose now.
Yeah, no, they'll lose again. But the thing is that I think you're right, and that's why back then, at least in the 1800s, they didn't have all the scientific data and information now. And this is why, because like you said, because they didn't say all white men are created equal, they said all men. That's why there's some people that still feel this need to try and scientifically prove that there's a difference between men, right? That there's so that
and see, here's the thing about that, just real quick. Like, there must have been an argument about that, because I'm sure that there were plenty of people in the room that wanted to say all white men are created equal, but they decided not to put that in, when they wrote that. So, like, take from that what you want. But it's not like there were any shortage of people in America at that time.
You're right.
Would have been down for that.
And that's what I mean. Like, but this, I just want to finish out here with how this affects us in real life, because this in private, I've railed about this. This is my chance to get it out. A show like Ancient Aliens, that's really bothered me for 20 years because it comes on what I think used to be more of a reputable channel, something called the History Channel. And they have similar shows on other networks that used to be more reputable with information, like the Discovery Channel, that actually used to show factual documentaries about things. And now they've gone the road with which most entertainment has, which is just to entertain. But my point about Ancient Aliens is an example of pseudoscience, because it's pseudo-archaeology and pseudo-history, because there's no evidence or facts that will allow anybody serious to believe that aliens came down from outer space and helped humans build these structures and then left and didn't leave any other evidence of their being here. And I know this isn't a show about that, so I'm not going to spend so much time discussing it, but I've thought about it over the years too. Like, no one questions that people built big cathedrals in England and Germany 500, 1,000 years ago without the technology of today. Human beings did that. And, and that's what I mean. It's like when you have this idea that certain humans are really genetically inferior to others, that's what allows your mind to then bring in really bat crap crazy stuff like, oh, aliens came down from outer space and helped the Incas build their pyramids or helped the Egyptians build their pyramids.
Worse than that, it actually compels you to come up with that, because those types of things built thousands of years before any of that stuff in Europe that you're talking about. That kind of stuff undermines the idea.
But I think about the beautiful castle in Germany that the Disney castle is based of. Like, no one asks about, tries to say aliens built that. No one says that, aliens built the Tower of London or the London Bridge or the Eiffel Tower, right? And so, and I know the Eiffel Tower is a little more modern, but the others were built before we had electricity and gas-powered backhoes and things like that. So that's just what I want to say. And the other is, we'll have it in the show notes, just a study that was done over years, but as recently as 2016, that says 40% of medical students believe the sentences like Black people's nerve endings are less sensitive than white people's. Black people's skin is thicker than whites. Black people's blood coagulates more quickly than whites. None of that's true. And that's pretty sobering to hear that as recently as 2016, 40% of medical students believe that, which means they're practicing in the medical profession today. And that has real world consequences for Blacks not getting prescribed pain medicine as the same as whites, for being treated differently when they're in pain. And so that's what I mean, that this pseudoscience stuff has real world implications because human beings carry them in their head into their professions.
Even beyond that, you remember, like in the 1980s, the pseudoscience idea was that Blacks were more prone to drug addiction, when you had the crack cocaine epidemic. And then, it's like, okay, you fast forward 30 years.
Led to different sentencing outcomes.
Yeah, different sentencing, criminal, like criminal statutes being put in a more punitive way, because it's like, well, since they're more prone to this, we got to deal with it with more force. If you contrast that to how the opioid epidemic, was treated, it wasn't that, hey, we got to, drop the hammer.
We got to punish these white people for doing opioids. Yeah.
Exactly. So, all of this stuff matters, like it's not just, some philosophical debate, but all that does though, is it illustrates why the need to push back when this stuff pops back up again, and the need to preserve the ability to learn about history. Both of those hand in hand is something that remains important. So but I mean, I definitely think it's something, like I said, we'll have some stuff in the show notes on this, and it's something that people should familiarize themselves with, because it definitely seems like this is something that people are trying to mainstream again. I guess enough time has passed that living memory is changed enough that they're going to try to mainstream it again. And then, people who, who care about facts and care about what can be proven true and so forth, I have to push back on it. So, but we appreciate everybody for joining us on this episode of Call Like I See It. Subscribe to the podcast, rate it, review it, tell us what you think, send it to a friend. Until next time, I'm James Keys.
I'm Tunde Ogunlana.
All right, we'll talk to you next time.